Ever. She is PADI certified in open water,
Are you, Mark?
nitrox, and cave diving, which is really cool. And she also, as education director, I just want to point out that she also participated in a youth media program that we have done now for 5 years in Chicago, where we bring journalists in to mentor high school students on the south and west side to bring journalistic skills, a journalistic mindset, and a sort of big picture advice on how to make globally relevant a doable Chicago West Side story. It's an amazing example of sort of bringing the world to these kids, helping them understand what it is to be a journalist by actually helping them do the projects themselves. And for a 10-year journalism teacher who basically taught journalism by, I liken it to a shop class. We made things and then we talked about them. I think that approach is the right one. So, am I leaving anything out? No. With that, Amy is going to talk to us about her Ethiopia work and possibly about her next project, which is her next article, which is looking ahead. Please join me in welcoming Amy back. She's also in a bike gang.
Okay, so this story is about. Okay. So the story is about humankind's origins. So I've gone to Africa a few times, usually to write about biomedical type things. So that's the main type of reporting that I do. But I have a history of studying evolutionary biology. So to me, Africa is always, I think of it as the place where humankind is from. And I wanted to do a story sort of about that. And then Ethiopia in particular, that's where Lucy was found in the 70s. And Lucy was the hominid. It's sort of, if apes and humans split 7 million years ago, and we're at the very cusp of that 200,000 years ago. In the middle, that's Lucy at 3 million years ago. In the last 10 years, there's been a number of new hominids. That's these, they're on our branch, they're our human ancestors. They're not quite Homo sapiens yet, that have been found in Ethiopia. And if you look at the papers, a lot of the people discovering them are Ethiopians. And those two things are related. The more people that are there, the more you'll find fossils. We actually know really very little about that 7 million year period of our evolution. So yeah, I wanted to go and I wanted to hear about science in that country. And I also just wanted to hear about human evolution. And then also talk to people who are from the place and grew up looking at the land, imagining what our ancestors did there for millions of years before we were there. So anyways, this photo is taken in Burhani Asfa's office, and what he's showing me is there's marks on the skull. It's not a Homo sapiens, it's Homo, but it's before Homo sapiens. There's all of these marks etched around the orbits of the eye and on the forehead. And what we get to do is we talked about what those, why would somebody have defleshed this? So his thought was, must have been a very important person, maybe they were trying to preserve the skull. This is something that's like a human-like behavior, this sort of mourning behavior, to do something artistic almost like that. That's before we occurred. So even though I say humanity or humankind, because it's not Homo sapiens anatomically exactly like us, but there's all of these signals that type things that are pointing towards humanity happened a lot earlier than we did. So anyways, that's Burhani, and we're in his office. Less fossils, there's skulls on his desk. And you just pick up all of these little things about what it's like to do science there. For example, there's no electricity right now. In Addis Ababa, the lights go out frequently. So when the sun goes down, that's when we stop talking. But anyways, we're here, I'm talking with him, and if there's any kind of lessons maybe I'll try and bring out without just talking about my trip, would be when you report, I try and keep in mind, as a science reporter, you get all the science. Do your homework first, know the details. But then keep in mind your universal themes. And so I'm thinking about origin of humanity and the future and fate, these big questions that sound really cheesy, but it's nice to ask them. Because I'm also looking for personality, because that's what I'm interested in. Science is a human endeavor, and there's scientists behind it. And they have really cool stories. And those stories also kind of highlight your big questions. And so for Barhani, when he thinks about what's interesting about humanity in the past, he points to this skull and shows me like these early signs of mourning and carving culture and things like that. And he also has an interesting story, because if you think about photos, maybe if you've seen photos of like discovery of pyramids or the discovery of Lucy, you'll usually picture an American or a European paleontologist by these bones, and that's sort of changing now. And Barhani is one of the earlier people in Ethiopia to start changing that. He started in the 80s. When he was an undergrad, he was thrown in jail by the military regime, and after that, they let him out, but he was assigned to go work in the geology building. And that's when he really fell in love with it. He ended up going to Berkeley to do studies. And there he had this experience of being in Berkeley and really loving the science, but also seeing terrible things happening in his country. That's when the Great Drought was. And he decided he wanted to go back and make it the kind of place he wanted it. So he did. And now there's a lot of Ethiopian researchers. But to go back to Ethiopia, it's not necessarily the cradle of humanity, even though that's where I would say the majority of hominid fossils are found. It's somewhere in Africa. We're not sure exactly where. There's been fossils in Kenya and South Africa. But Ethiopia is the best place to find human ancestor fossils because of the way preservation is. There's 3 tectonic plates that all converge here, and they're pulling apart. And what that does is it causes a lot of volcanic activity. There's tons of volcanoes, there's earthquakes. This is the Great Rift Valley where they're actually rifting apart. And as an effect of that, you get lots of bones, hominid bones, they get tumbled up in sand. And there's a layer of lava. You can date lava very easily because of the chemical composition. So you'll have a layer of 4 million years ago, and then sand with bones in it, and then a layer that's 3.8 million years ago, and then a layer of sand with bones in it. And so you basically have a time machine sort of with a layer cake, where you just cut down and be able to date each of these time periods. Whereas in other places, like in Chad, they found a very old skull, but it's hard to date those things if they're not within these layers. So paleontologists love it for this reason. So I went and I wanted to see it. So that's another little side note. When reporting, look for whatever action scenes you can find. You're there for a reason. So I drove down from Addis Ababa, this cool rainy capital, drove into the Rift Valley. You can just see all sorts of signs of this volcanic action I was talking about. This is actual rift, just because of all that plate movement. Here's a lake that is just growing by 8 millimeters every year, and that's just because the land is splitting. The water kind of flows into it. They already had to rebuild the highway. Pretty soon it's going to envelop the town. I went with a geology student from Addis Ababa University who was there to tell me about each of the rocks. So this is some basaltic rocks. There's not really farms there because I'm in this area because it's not good soil. Another area. And if you drive even further into the Afar, that's where this region is where they found these most amazing hominid fossils. So this photo isn't by me. This one was sent to me by Tim White. That's Barhani in the middle. That's the person who was in that first photo. That was back in the 90s. And he's there with Jonas Bayani and Tim White from Berkeley. These are some of the world's top early human evolution paleontologists. And this photo was taken, so after Barhani was in Berkeley, he wanted to come back. The Derg was ending, that military regime. The country was in a lot of turmoil, but he really wanted to go back and find these hominid fossils, because actually they're very rare. So that's why we know so little. I think Tim White put it to me, we could put all of them in like the base of 3 cowboy hats. There's not many of them. And if you think about it, we know so much about like castles, but we know very little about our actual evolution from the apes. So he wrote all these very passionate grant proposals to say we need to go there now, even though the country's in turmoil, because we need to find these things unless, they could just get ruined in all the conflict and things like that. So he organized this north to south expedition in the 90s. It came out with all sorts of things. Probably one of the most important is this hominid called Ardipithecus ramidus. This is just the skull. There's also a full skeleton from it and everything like that. What's cool about this is, before we knew about this is from 4.4 million years ago. Before we knew, there was this idea that you might have heard about. I know I thought it was the case. Apes basically were in the trees, and then the climate warmed, and then there was less trees and there was a lot of savanna. So apes sort of like knuckle walked and then learned to walk gradually more upwards. That was the story. But this is why it's so important to have bones, because when they found Arby, they realized, number one, this was a full-fledged bipedal walker. Its toes are in line with its foot, so it was walking flat-footed. And also, it was in a woody area. All of the animals around it were woodland creatures. So there was no savannas. It was walking in the woods. So that story was a really nice story, but it's not true. So that's one nice thing they found bones. This is another paleontologist I was able to meet. This is Rai Amaseged. And during that time in the 90s, when Berhani and Chinmoy and all these people were in the Afar, he was a young student. He didn't have a job or a salary. He was assigned to work in geology building as well. He was really into it, and he decided he wanted to do his own trip. He didn't have a grant to go, but he wanted to try going to this area called the Kika, and it was near where Lucy was found, but nobody dared to go there because there's two tribes that have constant conflict. But it's another reason why it's nice to be local. He kind of felt that he would be able to manage it. He could talk to people of the land really well. He asked the army for 4 people to come with him to act as security guards. And then on that trip, that was the first Ethiopian road trip, he found this skull here. It's from a child. It's Lucy species, but earlier than her, 3.2 million years ago. And there's a whole bunch of things to talk about that I won't bore you with. But one of them is that it showed that brain growth was really slow, and that's a unique thing about humans as well. Chimp brains, they come out of a bigger brain. Humans have big brains, but it takes us longer to grow. So again, this means that all of these features of humanity were much earlier in the time than we thought. I guess I can just show there. So the building I'm in Ethiopia, I should also say, is also new. This was just built in 2010. And that's great. And part of the reason why it was built is because they have all of these Ethiopian scientists who are able to talk with the government to say, this is something we need to put our money in. So they have this great building that's just full of all of these treasures. These are some stone tools from 1 million years ago. And again, this is all just to say, this is pre-Homo sapiens, but really important in our evolution. These are about 1 million years old, and it says a lot about how we evolved too, just to be able to make them. It's actually hard to make them. A lot of the scientists that have tried to make these tools, and they tell me it's really hard. They're trying to get everybody to figure out how to, in advance of finding progress, people think, I'm going to need a stone tool, I'm going to cut it with this, and bang rocks together. And then when you carry it on your body so that when you find the animal, you know how to carve it up. And then also, because you're eating meat, you're getting more calories, so then the brain can grow a little bit more. And they see this kind of correlation between better tools and bigger brain sizes. And also share the information. You start seeing the same types of stone tools within certain areas. So that's kind of an early sign of culture. People are teaching each other how to make them, and they're making them in distinct ways. Zerai, who's up here in the point, he thinks stone tool use actually happened a lot earlier than people think, than most people think. He thinks it started around 3 million years. They argue about this stuff nonstop. So while I also get to watch, mainly what the scientists do is argue. So this is them arguing over a piece of common bone that they recently found. And these guys have been working together for 30 years. And it's really nice to see them arguing in this place. Because like I said, the way it used to be done, one American or European scientist finding something and taking it back. now all of this science, this whole community is happening there in that place. And science it's arguing, it's thinking of new hypotheses, and so it was really nice to see all of this. Also, there's a lot of training, so there's a lot of undergraduates who are now working in the museum. This is one technician, and he's using a dental tool to scrape some of the sandstone off of a horn. And yeah, like I said, I guess I think trying to think of some of the universal things. I'll be writing a story later that's more about where we're going. But when I talk to people, like when I asked Sarai what he thinks about when he's really afar, and he's thinking about our ancestors that lived a long time before we did, he'll really talk about how it feels really deep to have this very long lineage. It goes back a lot farther than people really think about, and it makes him really care a lot about sustaining our society, keeping these fossils intact, and also making sure that we move forward in the right way. Because in Addis, in Ethiopia, it's a fast-growing economy. There's a lot of change. There's urbanization, there's mining, there's industry. There's all of these things can, they involve the land. So you could lose all of those fossils, lose the history. And one thing that Zerai and Berhani and a lot of these scientists are doing is pushing to make sure that when people move forward with development, they're also doing it in a conscientious way. If they're promoting tourism, they're doing it and making sure that they keep the fossils preserved, they keep them in the country, and do all of that. So I'll end with that. That's basically it. I will be writing another story from Ethiopia that's more about agriculture and things like that, but I felt like this is enough for now.
Thank you. We have questions.
Questions? Mr. Child.
Sorry. Okay, so two things. Right?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
And I think did we decide this one is working? Yeah.
No?
The microphone for sorry.
I thought that was great. And two things that I noticed that I think are important in dealing with science or technical issues are great conventional analogies or things that make it more comfortable to us, describing the layer cake effect in the Rift Valley, and also the drama and the conversations between the scientists, but also why someone can go and study in that area because of tribal conflict or because of even the national conflict that prevented these studies. So you did that exceptionally well. And apart from getting our own PhDs, is there a way that there's some tips that you can provide these people about how to keep those things in mind when approaching technical topics?
Yeah, I think it's funny because, so my natural inclination is to be very academic about everything. So, but do those things. Before I went, I read tons of papers, I took notes, I talked to lots of people on the phone, just to make sure that I knew all of the details. So that I wouldn't have to spend my time, my 1 week in Ethiopia, asking people, when was this found? So yeah, I learned all of the details. But then the things that I have to remind myself is that, what's going to make for a good story is going to be personal stuff too. And the big picture questions. So do all the homework, make sure it's technical, but then, I guess, you don't have to. I crammed in a lot of learning about human evolution pretty quick. And then also just asking how it felt when you found something. So not only figuring out, this is a 3.3-million-year-old child, like, how old are your kids? Your kids are like 3 years old. This thing is 3 years old. How does that make you feel? So just sort of just the stupid questions like that.
Is Amy's mic working?
No, it's not.
Not as well as yours.
Because I saw an orange light.
Hi.
Very, that's very good.
More questions? Well, I have one. Well, oh no.
Well, since you were talking about asking, those human questions, how do you feel? How was it for you, with your science background and going to this rich place that's like, where a lot of our ancestors came from? How was that for you? And how did you kind of incorporate that into the stories that you were doing?
That's a good question. I think what I tried to do, I don't know if I pulled it off well, but I mean, it was amazing. I think it was kind of, I thought of it as like the equivalent of somebody who's really religious going to like Mecca or Jerusalem or something like that, because that's what it felt like. It was really exciting for me. So I think in the story, I also really tried hard to just bring in sort of just natural enthusiasm for it. Yeah. And it was exciting to do also, because I think I have covered sort of darker topics. And I know that a lot of the people I spoke with were really excited about, they were excited to see the work they're doing in a really positive and great way.
Okay.
So we find that you, you think about how to be simple and relate to the journal as you write, or you write it and then go back over it, or you show it to an editor who tells you what
I think, I honestly prepare by talking to everyone about it. Like when I go out at night, if I'm at a bar, I'll talk to people about it and I'll monitor if their eyes are glazing over. I can't cut that. So that's honestly what I do. I just run it by everyone. I just talk about it and I take little notes in my head over the things that people are excited about and things they're not so excited about.
So you're doing it as you go along.
Yeah.
Because you've already
Constantly.
sort of rehearsed it.
Yeah. I'm constantly kind of thinking about how I might do it. Yeah, not the story's been edited, but I think, I don't think it was, I think maybe if anything it was too, I think when I originally wrote it, it was much longer and a little less science. I mean, I have a background in science, so I realized that I was very bored by it. So, I'm constantly being like, did I lose you yet? Don't go away.
Questions? Okay. As soon as I start, that's a cue. That gets the hands up.
Have you had to make up terms? I mean, there's jargon I can understand.
I haven't made up terms. There's little things that I give choices for. So, example, I say human ancestors, and I got in a conversation with a scientist who's like, well, I don't know if you can say ancestor. We talked about if you had a great cousin, is that your ancestor? And then at some point I was like, splitting hairs, and I overrode his critique about not saying ancestors. So in that case, I felt like it was fine.
I'm going to jump right in. Your project description for us talks about sort of the potential end of humanity, or what we might do to preserve ourselves as a species, and also alludes to climate change as it's affecting people in East Africa. And I think maybe that's part of what you might do next. I wonder if you could give us a little preview of the full cycle of this project.
Yeah. But I mean, I haven't done that story yet. So these thoughts aren't totally well formed. But I think the basic idea is this. Something else that's very clear in a place like Ethiopia is that they will be affected by climate change much more strongly than we will here. Number one, just because they already have droughts and floods and it's going to become more severe. Number two, because the poverty is so high. Farmers in Colorado have a terrible drought. It's awful, but they usually have farm insurance so that they can recover faster. There's no, that's it. If you lose all of your money because there's a drought, you lose it all. You sell all of your equipment, sell your livestock, and then that's just sort of it. So it's pretty dire. And so I think there is a lot of work going on right now in Ethiopia and from international organizations who are trying to figure out how can they become more resilient. And so on one hand, there's modernization. The slide I showed just at the end of like factories and mining. That's not necessarily dark, but brings money into the country. So being richer will help. But then also if they lose all of their natural resources, that's not so good for subsistence farmers. So I think people are definitely thinking about that. And they're worried about it. And I think the next thing I'll be writing about is some of the ways they're handling it. I saw a lot of subsistence farmers who lived on like certain kinds of endemic plants through droughts that kind of last through droughts well. And I'm interested in sort of learning a little bit about those plants. But they sort of feel like that's their holdout, their refuge of like in the highlands with these older big plants that aren't cash crops. So yeah, that's where it's going. It's sort of, what's the end game? Kind of the ironic thing is I showed you all of these tools that led to our big brains and made us the most successful species on the planet, depending on how you rate success. But ironically, those are, it's our ability to make technology that's going to be driving us to the end. And it is very sad that a place like Ethiopia in Africa is going to feel the worst of it because I think they account for like 2% of emissions. It's not good.
More questions?
What's it like being at an archaeological dig? All right, truth time. Is it just like Jurassic Park? The truth is, it was the rainy season when I went, and there was tons of flooding in the region they usually go to. So they usually use the road's end. You're going into the bar. That's that triangle that's seen down now. They use the riverbeds to drive through, and those were all flooded. So that's why they were all in the museum. So I didn't go on the tour. I heard it's funny.
I'll think about that.
Thanks. That's what I figured anyway. I was like, I still got to talk to them all, and I drove out there anyway as a student, but I didn't know what actually
I think you're talking about walking the balance between informing your reader of information that you're particularly interested in as a scientist, and also telling a story as a journalist. That's obviously something we're all trying to do. How do you use your discretion to decide what things to include? What's critical for the reader to know about the science in order to tell the story of humanity? And in your experience, how effective has that been? And how have your readers responded to this work? Is it more on the scientific side that people are responding, or is it more on the story side that people are responding?
I think on this story, people like the story. Yeah. I did. Because it could become dry for you, like if you just put like the dates of all the different species. Got it? So I worked on the story. As far in general for science reporting, I think I like the idea of like just cover 3 topics or something. But just keep it, think of your name, what the main message is. The main message for me was the story of pushing back the dates of like humans. So that's what I want to show, and I'm only going to talk about 3 fossils, only 2 here, 3 fossils that are pushing back those dates. So keep it simple. Try not to use too much.
I noticed there's some really beautiful graphics in your presentation. How important is that to science reporting, and is that something that reporters outside of science writing need to think about more? Because I really, from a photographer standpoint, we're always pushing writers to think more photographically, but no one really advocates for thinking more about graphics.
Yeah, so I think it's huge. I'm really lucky because I'm at this magazine now, so I got to be really bossy. And I don't usually get to do that. Like for this one, so for this one, yeah. So I think it's huge, and I try and really push for it. And I always try and talk to the art director, and I really pushed the art team that Nautilus pretty hard on it. Buy them all wine afterwards. So we made this one's actually interactive on the website.
Oh, cool.
So what you can do is you can like turn off these things and just see the plates and these arrows, and you can see how the plates are pulling apart, and you can see where the volcanoes pop up. I thought that was really helpful, and I thought about doing it because I wanted this map when I was trying to. If you Google Rift Valley, there's terrible images. They really are awful. Like, it's really hard to figure out what's going on. So it's really nice to work with good artists who really work on doing things. I think it's important.
Amy, do you have plans for the next, the next year, the next 2 or 3 years? Or how do you sort of chart your own course as a scientist, as a science journalist?
I mean, I hope, I don't know, I like what I'm writing now, and it's really a privilege to get to write stories that I love. Because I think I've worked freelance a lot, and you always have to take jobs people are assigned to. So it's a nice luxury to be able to just work on the stories you write versus the stories people ask you to do. So the more I can do this, the better it is. And I think it's a better story in the end, and I write a better story when I'm excited about it.
I was thinking more, do you have like the next 3, 4 stories in mind that you want to pursue?
Oh, in my head?
In your head.
Yeah, probably more. But yeah, definitely. Especially for this, for Ethiopia, like I said, I have other ideas that are very different from this about agriculture and climate change.
I'm just curious if there are any publications that are not science-based publications, like you do science or social without doing it.
Yeah.
What publications?
Well, I mean, I think like Daily Time magazine's had some really nice stories. I've been writing for the TV. Al Jazeera is good for. Al Jazeera's reached out to me for like public health stuff, which was great because those how even like nature and the science ones, I have a hard time with public health. And Al Jazeera seems to be interested in public health. Like New York Times is doing a good job with the data.
One other question, are you aware of the work of Paul Salomon, who is also a cancer center? And he has started a walk, a 7-year walk around.
Yes, I am.
All right. So
I don't know him by name, but I've heard of this. It sounds really cool.
Yeah, I just want, I mean, we both have 2 different approaches to the origins of humankind. If you were aware of this work,
I should be.
how you thought the 2 interpretations work together.
I know, it's so neat seeing how many different ways you try the same sort of thing.
So I would encourage everyone here to look at Amy's work on the site, and then you also might want to look at Paul Salomon's, which is a veterinary question. You he also started but he gets into the science. So, are there more questions? Okay, so I think, Tom, go ahead.
You never did do science.
Not at all. In fact, it's pretty bad until you have some experience writing. In the beginning, people are like, there's no way you're going to talk to people. Totally, maybe a negative. I have one tip. You don't need a PhD, but like, get a textbook. I think from seeing different people getting into it, just learn the basics.
Well, on that note, thank you.